How's it going, Spare Parts Army? I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Recently, we've seen a parade of Russian military vehicles over the past few weeks, and a lot of people have found them very difficult to tell the difference between all these vehicles. How do you tell the difference between a BTR and a BMP? What is a BMP even capable of doing on the battlefield? And where did the idea originally come from? And at the end of the video, we're going to take a look at the Russian Army's most up-to-date version of the BMP called the BMP3.
In this video, we want to examine and analyze what exactly might be wrong with the BMP that it's performing so terribly in the war in Ukraine.
The BMP is kind of like the backbone of the Russian infantry, the ground forces. You see it everywhere. You know what? Scratch that. It's basically the backbone of a lot of different armies. The Ukrainian military uses the BMP, but there are a lot of reports now of their downsides. Could it just be maintenance problems? What's really the truth about the BMP? Like most modern Soviet military developments, the BMP can trace its roots back to World War II. During the war, there was never really a dedicated armored personnel carrier for the infantry, typically forcing them to make do with unarmored flatbed trucks that were widely vulnerable to enemy fire and unable to keep up on poor terrain. After World War II, the Soviets began focusing more on motorizing their force with additional beefed-up vehicles coming in the form of the early BTR and BRR models, though as a whole, the Soviets were not happy with their vehicle's performance in combat. Development of a dedicated infantry combat vehicle began in the 1960s. The goal was to create a platform that not only could carry infantry, but also support them in the fight once they dismounted. After a few years of rapid development, the prototype was labeled Object 765, later BMP. It was selected and produced by Chelyabinsk tractor plant. Although the BMP's effectiveness in agrarian pursuits are a little bit questionable. The BMP-1 was truly the first of its kind as a dedicated infantry fighting vehicle, as opposed to the simply armored personnel carrier doctrines used by other modern militaries at the time. Russia was the first military to adopt a vehicle like this. Although technically the first ever infantry fighting vehicle is said to be the German-made Schutzpanzer Lang HS-30, which was created in 1956 during the Cold War by West Germany. The important thing to know about the Schutzpanzer Lang was that it was a major departure from what was considered to be the predominant military doctrine of the time that, the United States and everyone was using in the West. These battle taxis would see troops riding into battle and then dropped off, and the vehicles would let them fend for themselves. They ended up being wrong, and the direction that all militaries went was similar to the BMP. I couldn't find any information on whether the Soviets were inspired by the German Schutzpanzer Lang, if that inspired them to make the BMP-1. In any event, the first version of the BMP came standard with three main weapon systems. So you had your 73mm smoothbore cannon, which was capable of firing AP, or armor-piercing rounds, or HE high explosive rounds, depending on your target type, if you're targeting personnel or vehicles. So you had your A9M114 launcher, which was meant to tackle more heavily armored targets like main battle tanks. And last but not least, you had your PKT coaxial machine gun. Coaxial means that basically it's a machine gun welded straight onto the turret, so it points where the turret points. It's actually kind of an antiquated design choice today, but back then it was all the rage. The crew consisted of a driver, a gunner, and a commander, and then you had 8 infantry in the back who were able to dismount, or actually originally they could fire out of the side of the vehicle out of these little dedicated portholes on the vehicle's side. Those portholes have since then been the focus of a lot of fuss and debate in the military community, with everyone pretty much really disliking them. Shooting out of the portholes is laughed at these days. By placing those holes in the armor, it weakens the armor, and it does very little in the way of adding combat power in return. Sure, there are some additional situational awareness, but I don't know. No thanks. The vehicle was designed to help mitigate radiation effects in the case of nuclear weapons. To add to all of this, it was also an amphibious vehicle, meaning it could easily cross bodies of water directly without the need of external engineering support, which would slow battlefield tempo. We've seen, for instance, in the battles in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian armed forces, they've been destroying bridges to slow down the Russian army advance. Technically, these tanks should be able to cross some of these rivers, but the conditions, if they're not perfect for crossing, then it's not really gonna work. And with that being said, if you were to ask me if I would volunteer to sit in the back of one of those vehicles while it drives through deep water, I'd ask you to go kindly fuck off. The BMP platform saw its first combat in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War with the Egyptian military, where it was received with kind of mixed reviews. While it did excel in its battlefield taxi role, easily keeping up with armored tanks across the battlefield and protecting infantry, it was kind of lackluster in its actual fighting capabilities. Crews reported, for instance, that the 73mm cannon was really noticeably inaccurate and unreliable. And being that it was only a single shot, it had to be manually reloaded after every round, making making rates of fire lower than needed for follow-up shots. Russian crews also had a lot of complaints about the vehicle in their training. Non-export Russian models contained autoloaders, which were reportedly even slower than hand-load and dangerous to operate. The vehicle was also incredibly front-heavy, which is not ideal for amphibious operations because the nose of the vehicle could get caught in the mud while you're trying to cross a river. To address these issues, a series of stopgap solutions were made to improve the design, while work began on an entirely new model of the BMP, the aptly named BMP2 Genius. So it had its first production run in 1980, and it brought in a slew of new quirks and features. While the chassis was nearly identical, it did add some additional armor and adjustments to whole crew layout. The largest improvement to this version of the BMP came with its fancy new turret design. Previously, the BMP-1 had a one-man turret with just a gunner sitting all by his lonesome. The BMP-2 introduced a two-man turret with the commander now sitting with the gunner, and most importantly, he had a complete weapons overhaul.
I have a theory about why the Russian BMP might be performing so poorly in Ukraine right now, and that's because they're still using a lot of these old BMP-2 Soviet-era tanks. All they have is this IR spotlight that shines a giant infrared spotlight out so they can only see within like 100 meters. It's a really terrible night fighting capability. So it appears like the Russian military has really failed to upgrade the turret systems on all of these BMPs. So there's no advanced targeting systems and there's no stabilization, which allows gunners to fire on the move. So it looks like they were really hoping to be able to rely on the explosive reactive armor to defeat javelins or any incoming missile projectile, but it looks like it's unable to defeat modern anti-tank systems. We'll get into some more of the flaws in just a minute.
So the 73mm cannon was replaced with a 30mm autocannon. They also upgraded the launcher so it was capable of firing the AT-4 and AT-5 anti-tank guided missile systems. The 30mm gun was completely a game changer, going from being this unreliable single-shot weapon to a fully automatic link-fed weapon capable of firing 550 rounds per minute. Not only did it have a longer range and more accuracy, but it was much more effective against the targets that it was expecting to encounter. This was especially effective in the Soviet Union war in Afghanistan in the late 1970s and 1980s, as the 30mm cannon allowed for a much higher angle of elevation, meaning that they could engage targets that were placed in the mountainous terrain. Crews that were still using the BMP-1 would often get caught in ambushes from high angles and be completely unable to engage targets. After the war in Afghanistan, the BMP-2 began to be sold to numerous other Soviet-friendly nations, with over 30 countries in total eventually adopting the platform. And they eventually created different versions of their own to suit their own needs in those countries. Just like new privates in basic training, they might all look the same, but they're all special in their own way. The BMP-2 and its modernized version serve in the Russian military to this day, and for good reason. The BMP overall is a simple design, meaning that it's easier to fix, easier to operate, and generally more reliable, although now we've seen with the new reports that if you don't maintain it, it doesn't matter how reliable it is. This is the kind of quality you want your equipment to have when you rely on them in large numbers. If it stops working, just bang it with a hammer a few times and then get it back into operation. Now obviously there's going to be extents to how far you can push this vehicle. I would say that the AK is definitely more reliable. That thing you can really just put it in the mud and then it still is fine. The BMP, it's a vehicle. It needs love and care. The 30mm autocannon is still a formidable weapon system to this day, able to fire multiple round types from different targets. So upgrades to the number and type of ATGM launched from the BMP have also kept pace with modern tank development, with most carrying multiple Kornet missile launchers, which pose a serious threat to any armored target, although we don't know how many of these vehicles are actually outfitted with it in the Russian military. While the 1.9 million American dollars might seem a bit steep for your average working class Russian, when compared to other platforms available, it's a steal. It's the Toyota Corolla of armored vehicles. It's not flashy by any means, but if you throw enough of them at a problem, you're probably going to get the job done. Before we get into the latest and most powerful version of the BMP-3, check out this playlist on all of the military vehicles that we've covered on this channel, including all the military equipment that the US military has. The Soviets, who considered themselves to be never happy with good enough, continued to push the BMP design and began developing a new model of the BMP in the early 1980s. While the BMP-2 was still being fielded Soviet units, it was still very aptly named, you guessed it, the BMP-3. The original full name for the BMP-3 was the Return of Stalin, but it didn't pan out well with focus groups. While the BMP-2 was largely designed as an upgraded BMP-1, the BMP-3 was an entirely new design, and it began full-rate production and manufacturing in 1987. The first and most noticeable change here is the new 100mm main gun. Needless to say, this brings an entirely new level of firepower to the platform. It's capable of firing the 9M117 Bastion anti-tank guided missile, as well as high explosive fragmentation rounds to target troops in cover. Going with the mentality that more is better, it still has a 30mm cannon coaxially attached, capable of firing the same kind of round as the BMP-2 and a 7.62 machine gun, because more is more. Now, the obvious drawback to having that many weapons on a troop carrier is that it limits the amount of ammo that the vehicle can practically carry. But because each weapon system is used for very specific target types, it means there won't be a lot of ammunition overlap, which isn't great. A target that you would use the 100mm for is a different target than the 30mm, and the same for the machine gun. This is different than the Bradley's philosophy, which really goes Oprah style, hands out 25mm to the entire crowd. According to reports, which I do not honestly know how much we can trust these Russian reports on their vehicles, so take it with a grain of salt, but the BMP-3 is said to be able to fire stationary, moving, or even when it's afloat in the water with the same level of accuracy, which is a pretty impressive thing if it's true. It has a 27 horsepower to tonnage ratio, I think that's how you say it. The vehicle is fast traveling at 72 kilometers per hour on the road. The logistics claims for the vehicle are that it can go up to 600 kilometers in operational range, which I don't know if I really believe that, because the circumstances under which the vehicle can drive that long without fuel doesn't seem likely. After what we've seen so far of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I have begun to seriously doubt the effectiveness of the BMP-3. To be fair, a lot of destroyed vehicles that we saw so far were the older BMP-1 and 2 generation. According to open source intelligence on the matter, we believe that the Russians created around 2,000 of these BMP-3s so far, although I don't know if I believe that number either. The BMP-3 had a completely redesigned hull. It takes an unconventional design approach by putting the engine in the back of the vehicle. This is different than most IFV designs because you typically want to maximize the space in the rear so that dismounted troops can more easily get in and out of the vehicle quickly. So the engine is mounted below the troop compartment as opposed to the front of the hull like previous designs. This was a trade-off as it made the crew compartment more cramped in the back for dismounts, but it afforded additional armor to the front of the vehicle for protection. The vehicle claims to have protection against small arms rounds that are bigger than the American 50 caliber bullet, so it claims to be able to stop up to a 12.7mm round and possibly even greater. The BMP-3 really represents the final evolution of the BMP series as it applies to Russian doctrine. The overall Russian strategy focuses on speed and overwhelming firepower, which is why it's been such a devastating disaster for them, this invasion. The BMP-3 achieves this with a numerous amount of weapon systems, meaning it doesn't have to wait for more heavily armored units to engage targets. It rivals American vehicles in terms of off-road performance, that I believe is true. It has high reliability if you maintain it, meaning that it has less of a chance of breaking down while on missions if you maintain it, and it includes amphibious capabilities, meaning additional bridging assets won't be necessary. The BMP-3 is fully equipped to rapidly take the fight to any target anywhere it might be. Now, the BMP is currently slated to be replaced by the Kruganaut 25, Russia's latest and greatest development in the world of infantry fighting vehicles. But due to the widespread distribution of the BMP, modernizations of the platform, its relevance on the modern battlefield, even Ukraine, everyone uses this, and its countless numbers of derivatives and variants, some more practical than others, means that the BMP will be a staple of mechanized warfare for decades to come. Let us know what you think of the BMP. What do you think its real capabilities are? What do you think about its performance in the Ukrainian invasion so far? A lot of people think that it's been a giant letdown and that everyone who's afraid of the BMP, who comes from, if you use a Bradley, people were afraid of the BMP before, but now looks like maybe not. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a new video. I'm your average soldier, Chris Cappy. You're watching Task and Purpose. Follow me at Cappy Army on Instagram for live updates. While you're here, check out this playlist on all of the military vehicles that we've covered over the past 3 years.